Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the next webinar presented by the Global ESCO Network. Today about government actions to foster the development of ESCO markets. Our presenters today are Dilip Limaye, President from SRC Global, and Singh, the lead energy specialist from the World Bank. Before I hand you over to our experts today, I will just take a couple of minutes of your time. My name is Søren Lütken. I'm chairman of the Global ESCO Network, who's bringing to you this webinar today. We're based in Copenhagen, hosted by UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center, but we are, as the name says, a global network of professionals and ESCO associations, and we are indeed global, spanning, and I can maybe show you the map here right away. As ESCO associations are 35, partnering with the Global ESCO Network. We're covering more than 90% of ESCO associations on the planet. The green color here on the map represents where we have ESCO associations active. The blue are the few that are not yet haven't joined the network yet. But we truly believe that we can call ourselves global. We're guided by an advisory board of 7, and Dilip Limaye, who's presenting to you today, also is one of them. The Global ESCO Network works for the integrated use of the ESCO as the implementation partner for energy efficiency, and it's motivated mainly by climate change. The mission of the Global ESCO Network is to add to and reinforce the efforts of the national and regional ESCO associations to promote. I would really want you to note the date of the second international ESCO symposium, which we are planning for May the 7th and 8th next year in Istanbul, Turkey, hosted by Turkish ESCO Association, IODER, in Istanbul, with, we hope, at least to gather at least 200 professionals, ESCO stakeholders and professionals from all over the world, including, of course, also the ESCO associations. We are proud that our first International ESCO Symposium in Paris this year has led to this development and the growing interest in the ESCO industry globally, which allows us now to move forward with the second symposium, and we would really like to see you in Istanbul in May 26. So please mark the date as on the screen here, the 7th, 8th of May, and stay tuned for further information about the program. It will be sent to you over the next weeks. We're working hard on a really interesting program. So stay tuned, and that will be it for me. Handing over to Dilip. Note that you can put your questions in the chat box during the presentations. We will have a Q&A session after the 2 presentations, both Dilip and Jas. After their presentations, we run the Q&A at the end. So thank you very much, and looking forward to the presentations.
Thank you, Søren. The presentation will be focusing on potential government actions to help develop ESCO markets. And this is based on my experience over the last 20+ years in both helping governments develop ESCO markets as well as trying to develop ESCOs myself. And I have had various successes as well as failures. And some of the presentation today will discuss why certain things have succeeded, certain things have failed, and where ESCOs, particularly in new markets, can be helped by government actions to move forward. Just by way of introduction, energy needs throughout the world will continue to increase through economic development, and most countries that have defined SDG goals as well as Paris commitments will need substantial amounts of scaling up of energy efficiency And energy efficiency, as we all know, represents the so-called first fuel. It is estimated by the IEA that the investments needed for energy efficiency need to be about 40% of the total required to meet the net zero goal, and almost $1.8 trillion. While governments and international financial institutions have made large investments in energy efficiency, there is a requirement for substantial additional capital from commercial financing sources, because all of the resources of governments and IFIs will not be sufficient to meet the energy efficiency investment needs. And here's where ESCOs have a potential role in meeting these needs. Now, when I'm talking about ESCOs here, I want to basically just remark that there are many different types of ESCOs. Now, we have definitions of ESCOs created by the Global ESCO Network as well as others, and I will go over some of the key characteristics in a minute. But I just wanted to mention that ESCOs, or energy service providers, can provide engineering services, financial services, performance contracts, as well as outsourced business models. This chart actually shows the different types of ESCO models and showing the degree of risk and benefit to the hosts and to the ESCO. But when we come down to what are the typical services provided by ESCOs, I think probably everybody in this meeting will know that there is a wide range of ESCO services that are provided by these organizations. And these include engineering, construction, design, installation, M&V, and commissioning. But in addition, ESCOs can provide or arrange financing and also contribute to operations and maintenance and training. Now, in my experience with working with ESCOs over the last umpteen years, I want to characterize the key elements of ESCOs in the following way. And while there are different ESCO models, the main points are that ESCOs provide or arrange for a package of implementation services for energy efficiency. Second, they offer business models under which customers pay for energy services from the cost savings achieved. Payments to the ESCO are contingent upon achieving certain performance guarantees, so these performance-based models mostly. And ESCOs assume most or all of the technical, financial, and performance risks. And these four characteristics of ESCOs are common in the various ESCO business models. But despite the fact that ESCO benefits have been recognized by governments all over the world, the development of ESCOs in LICs and MICs, which is referring to low-income and middle-income countries, has been rather limited. Now, ESCOs provide a lot of benefits. Mobilize innovation, entrepreneurship from the private sector, provide the latest innovations in technologies and products and equipment, reduce project risk, mobilize private financing, offer a wide range of business models, all suitable for different conditions, provide high-quality installation, operation, and maintenance services, provide faster completion, and also provide training. So these are the benefits, but they are limited by a number of barriers that have affected the development of ESCOs in many markets. For example, these barriers can be categorized into various types: policies and regulations, institutional barriers, market barriers, financing barriers, and technical capacity. Then there are some specific barriers related to the public sector energy efficiency, where it is important that governments can promote ESCOs in the public sector, but there have been many barriers to that happening. I will go through very quickly some of these barriers and what actions could be taken to mitigate them. So let's first start with policy and regulatory barriers. The main barriers are that in many countries, there is limited development of national legislation and lack of an articulated long-term strategy and targets for efficiency improvement. So the mitigation actions that many countries have taken are to enact an Energy Efficiency Act, a specific act focusing on energy efficiency, as well as supporting secondary legislation, and along with that, develop the strategy and targets consistent with the national goals for meeting various targets, such as the Paris commitments, SDG goals, and net zero goals. But we are also limited by the fact that many countries have low energy tariffs based on various types of subsidies. And these need to be corrected in order to provide the economic incentive or the financial incentive for ESCOs to operate in these markets. So prices need to be reformed. There is generally a lack of supportive regulation regarding performance contracting, and these can be corrected by providing the appropriate regulations. Sorry, I went back too fast, sorry. There are lack of energy efficient building codes, building certification, and appliance labeling and standards, which are all barriers to energy efficiency in general, but they all affect ESCOs because ESCOs cannot provide the appropriate services when these barriers exist. Moving on to institutional barriers, quite often there are conflicting or overlapping responsibilities among various ministries for the design and implementation of energy efficiency programs. The actions required, or some actions that have been taken by governments, include developing formal mechanisms for coordination and cooperation amongst the various public agencies and designation of specific responsibilities. There is limited awareness among energy users regarding performance contracting and ESCOs. This can be corrected by developing pilot ESCO projects and disseminating success stories. In many countries, the existing service levels are inadequate. In cold countries, the heating levels are inadequate. In warm countries, the cooling levels might be inadequate. And these are things that ESCOs cannot correct by themselves. The governments need to provide grant support to allow facilities to meet national norms for comfort levels or service levels. There is also some issues with respect to investment needed to improve structural deficiencies or safety needs. And again, these are not things that ESCOs can provide because there are no economic benefits directly to the ESCO from doing this. And therefore, grant support may be needed where governments can provide grants to take care of these difficulties. And of course, there's a lack of incentive amongst large energy consumers. And this is a common practice, particularly in the industrial sector in many developing countries. And we require, in this case, actions to require mandatory energy audits and implementation, which will then provide an incentive for them to engage and entertain ESCO services. With respect to markets, some of the barriers are that the large energy users may not trust or may not have belief in the ESCO operations model and the fact that ESCOs can indeed provide guaranteed performance levels. This is important because governments can help here in providing information on measurement and verification protocol, demonstrating successful energy efficiency projects performed by ESCOs, and actually document the achieved benefits. Also, governments in some countries have developed accreditation schemes for ESCOs, which increase the credibility of ESCOs on the part of the potential energy users. Another barrier is the high project development and transaction costs, because in markets that are trying to develop the ESCO services, there are no standard templates for auditing, contracting, and other aspects. Governments can help here through technical assistance programs to develop standardized contract templates and information on performance contracting models. There is a limited market demand for energy efficiency products and services, and this needs to be addressed, particularly in the public sector, so that long-term strategies and related programs can be developed to assure a large market demand for energy efficiency services, which many of them can be performed by ESCOs. And then the limited experience with performance contracting mechanisms can be fixed by developing and disseminating information and examples of performance contracting. Going down to financing, this is one of the biggest issues. Financing is not readily available, partly because commercial financial institutions perceive that there is a high risk in ESCO projects. Now, this can be addressed by providing risk-sharing guarantees that could protect that, and this has been done in some countries. The public private commercial financing institutions also do not have appropriate financial products for ESCO projects. And this can be, again, addressed by the governments by developing and disseminating examples of successful products from international experience. Some financial institutions complain that the project size of energy efficiency projects performed by ESCOs is generally small compared to their other projects, other traditional investments, and therefore they incur high transaction costs to implement these projects. This can be addressed by developing templates to streamline traditional projects, aggregating projects, and obtaining a higher project size to make the transaction costs more appropriate for the project size. In many of these countries, market interest rates are very high and repayment periods are generally very short, generally no more than 5 years. Governments can address this by offering concessional financing to the financial institutions through a credit line, which provides preferential or concessional financing. And there is limited availability of ESCO equity funds. Most ESCO balance sheets are limited. It would be useful if governments can develop a facility called forfeiting, which allows them to purchase ESCO's receivables and allows the ESCO then to reinvest that capital into the next project. With respect to capacity building, in most markets, the skills and capacity for technical assessment, developing business models, and managing risk are very low. Technical assistance need to be provided to ESCOs to build these skills and capabilities so that they can operate successfully in these markets. In some countries, we have noticed that the capacity of energy auditors is limited, and some of the energy audits are of poor quality. This requires actions to develop and implement auditor training programs, as well as certification of auditors. There is a need for formal measurement and verification, and while there are international protocols that are accepted in many countries, some of the developing countries have not yet adopted these M&V protocols, and that is needed, as well as providing training and capacity building to create an M&V professional industry that can support the measurement and verification of ESCO projects. Banks generally have limited capacity for technical and financial appraisal, and it would be very useful to address that by conducting a capacity building program for loan officers and risk managers in banks and financial institutions. And with respect to the capacity of the energy users themselves, many facility managers and energy managers do not really recognize and appreciate the benefits that ESCOs can provide. So conduct capacity building programs on performance contracting for facility and energy managers. Now, with respect to public sector, the idea here is that the governments can encourage ESCO projects in the public sector and provide what we call leadership by example. But public sector ESCO projects are, again, limited by many specific barriers to the public sector. Restrictive budgeting procedures that do not allow energy cost savings to be retained in future budgets. This needs to be corrected by allowing the retention of cost savings and allowing multi-year budgeting and longer-term contracts. Public procurement regulations often require the selection of the lowest upfront cost provider, which is not appropriate for ESCOs because what you want is the most or the greatest value provider rather than the lowest upfront cost. This can be corrected by changing procurement rules to adopt selection based on net present value rather than on upfront costs. There are limitations of public debt. So public agencies cannot borrow beyond their limitation, and this can be corrected by excluding ESCO payments from public debt limits. There's also a lack of borrowing and repayment history, which makes it difficult for ESCOs to get financing for public sector projects. And this can be addressed by utilizing public financing and pilot projects to demonstrate timely repayment. Lack of collateral. Public buildings cannot be used as collateral, so the financial institutions are very limited interest in using projects for financing projects for public sector, this can be addressed by establishing a risk-sharing guarantee facility. And we talked about this individual project size, which leads to high transaction costs. Governments can aggregate similar projects with schools, hospitals, other public buildings to come up with a larger project size. Public agency staff do not have the motivation and the incentives to engage in energy efficiency, and therefore little incentive to engage ESCOs. This can be addressed by establishing mandatory targets and reward exemplary performance by public agency staff. And again, there's limited knowledge, experience, and capacity among the public agencies, so technical assistance and capacity building is needed to help. Now, one of the key issues is financing and implementation strategies. We believe that innovative financing approaches combined with strong regulatory initiatives can create an environment that is conducive to ESCO project implementation. So even though these are not direct financing mechanisms for ESCOs, these are mechanisms that governments have adopted to help develop energy efficiency projects in the public sector, such as the energy efficiency revolving funds, creating and establishing a public or a super ESCO or credit line with a development bank. A second type of financing mechanism is one that can directly leverage commercial financing and help facilitate project implementation. And these include a credit line with a commercial bank, a risk-sharing facility, blended financing where capital grants or other mechanisms are used to combine private and public financing, management contracts with performance incentives, and public-private partnerships. Now, we've talked a lot about what the barriers are and what can be done. I'd like to spend just a minute or so on giving examples of selected countries where government actions have successfully been implemented and helped develop the ESCO markets. In the case of China, there was always a strong government policy, legislation, and mandatory targets supported by financial incentives, development of standardized energy management contracting model, and ESCO capacity building, and then establishment of regional public ESCOs with World Bank support. In India, same thing, the very strong government incentives through regulatory and policy initiatives, ESCO capacity building and accreditation program, financial incentives, and establishment of EESL as a super ESCO, leading to market transformation in energy efficiency. Now, one might question whether EESL has actually helped or hurt super ESCOs in ESCO markets in India, but the point is that they have led to a very strong market transformation and created a potential for ESCO activities. South Africa, a regulatory-driven DSM program provided financing for EE projects. A standard offer and a standard product program was developed by the World Bank for South Africa, which led to purchase of energy and demand savings, similar to what happens with renewable energy projects through the PPAs. A national energy agency provides technical support, financial assistance, and capacity building. And ESCO Market Development Initiative fosters public-private partnerships. Philippines has an EE Act with mandatory energy audits, training and capacity building programs for ESCOs, accreditation, and encouragement of public-private partnerships. Thailand has been working in this area for a long time, an act requiring energy audits and energy management plans by energy users, establishing ESCO fund, tax exemptions and tax credits, and establishing the Thai ESCO Association. In Dubai, regulatory initiatives and a national demand-side management strategy, Etihad Energy Service was established as a super ESCO and has stimulated ESCO services in the public sector. Standardized contracts have been very important, and an ESCO accreditation scheme is in effect. In the Czech Republic, public procurement procedures were reformed to facilitate ESCO contracts in the public sector, allowed retention of cost savings and multiple-year contracts to be engaged with public agencies, and a certification system was created for energy experts to ensure quality and reliability of ESCO services. What have we learned from some of this international experience? Strong and sustained government commitment is needed. Initially, focusing on the public sector allows the governments to lead by example and show that ESCO projects can work. Establishing EE targets for public agencies and mandatory audits for large users can create a demand for ESCO services. It is important to do stakeholder consultations to define the specific market and regulatory barriers in the country and develop potential solutions. And pilot efforts may be needed to test alternative procurement and financing schemes. Accreditation and certification schemes can help improve the credibility of ESCOs and create a beneficial impact on the market. And while there are wide ranges of business models, government should encourage the adoption of appropriate business models that are most suitable for the local market conditions. So governments need to develop a simple and transparent procurement system with well-defined rules, regulations, procedures, and supporting documents. And technical assistance programs are definitely needed to build the capacity of all stakeholders. Energy efficiency revolving funds and public or super ESCOs have been effective in developing the ESCO markets in many countries. Concluding remarks. Scaling up energy efficiency is critical to meet NDC targets and climate goals. Public financing and from governments and IFIs will not be sufficient to meet these. Scaling of commercial financing is an important need. ESCOs do provide a viable option for leveraging commercial financing, but experience has been limited. Many challenges exist, but they can be aggressively addressed through various policy, regulatory, financial, market development, and capacity building initiatives. Development of ESCO markets need a combination of actions. You can't just do one thing or two things. You need to have actions in a number of areas. And it does take considerable time, effort, and patience. International experience does provide very useful information and guidelines, but the selection of specific ESCO mechanisms, to promote ESCOs, need to be adopted to specific local conditions in the country. So to conclude, a simplified roadmap for facilitating and promoting ESCO markets, establish the national strategy and goals and targets, conduct the consultations with relevant stakeholders to identify the barriers and actions to be taken, facilitate innovative financing of ESCO projects, implement initiatives to increase the demand for ESCO services, remove barriers to public sector ESCO implementation, and develop and implement simplified ESCO models that can be adopted in the short term. And then as that moves forward, move forward towards more complex models as the markets mature. Thank you. I conclude here.
Thank you very much, Dilip. That was very interesting and a lot of barriers. I'm sure there's a lot of questions coming up on how do we pass those barriers? How do we break them down? But before we get to the Q&A session, and remember to put your questions in the chat. Over to you, Jess.
Great, thank you very much for the opportunity to share our experience from the World Bank, and greetings to you from Jakarta, where I am this week. We have been, the World Bank has been working on developing ESCOs for the past about 25 years. We also have a lot of successes and also a lot of failures, but we've learned a lot along the way. So happy to share some of our findings. Just a couple of points about the World Bank, because people often ask us, what are you guys doing in terms of energy efficiency? We have done about almost 7 billion over the last 10 years in energy efficiency. This is demand side energy efficiency. Our Europe and Central Asia region, which is Eastern Europe down to Turkey and over through Kazakhstan, represent about half. And then the Latin America region and East Asia each make up just a little bit less than 20%. So that's the bulk of where we've done a lot of our work, but we really hope to do a lot more in the other regions in the coming years. And people also ask by subsector. Just over 40% is in the public sector. This is public buildings and public lighting. But then we see quite a bit of energy efficiency demand in the residential sector, and we're starting to see much more in the water sector and industry and things of that nature. So, but we have a pretty broad spectrum of energy efficiency programs that we work on. Moving over to ESCOs, I think that Dilip has touched on a lot of the barriers. A few of the points that have been really difficult for us. One, as Dilip mentioned, is the poor building conditions. It's not only the fact that they require structural safety, they're not seismically safe, but they also have underheating, undercooling, poor lighting. So if you're going to renovate the building, we not only want to reduce the energy consumption, but we also want to improve the level of service. And sometimes improving the level of service does eat into some of the savings, which does impact the profitability of these projects. But since our goal is poverty alleviation, this is something that we need to find a way to be able to do both. In the developing world, many of our customers are not creditworthy. Public buildings or the public sector is not always known for paying bills on time or paying bills at all. SMEs and small and medium enterprises and also households sometimes have a challenge of accessing credit. Weak balance sheets for ESCOs. A lot of the ESCOs are very small service companies, consulting companies, and they just don't have the ability to provide long-term debt. And if they just provide a guarantee, sometimes their guarantee is not viewed as credible by banks if they don't have the balance sheet to back it up. And weak measurement verification, it's not just the protocols, it's the entire system. Lack of good data, sometimes there's no metering, sub-metering, no good protocols in place, and all of that leads to perceived risk on the part of ESCOs and potential for disputes down the line. We've done a lot of things to help address some of these barriers, starting with simpler models. This has been key for us. It doesn't mean that we only do simple models, but we start with simple models. Single technology ESCOs have worked very well. One-year contracts, you can always extend the contract over time, but starting with a one-year contract can be very helpful and much more manageable. Flexible contracts, leasing with simple verification tests, strengthen the ecosystem of ESCOs, legislation, developing standard tenders and templates. All of this helps reduce the transaction costs and reduce the potential for too much variability among different actors. And so people know what they're going to get when they get an ESCO contract. They know in advance what they should look for and what to expect. Facilitating ESCO financing has been key. Finding the right financial products in a given market to make this easier. Dilip talked about several of these mechanisms. In the public sector, we often use escrow accounts or something else to make sure there's at least 2 to 3 months of payments there, just in case the public sector has potential issues paying at one time or another. At least the ESCO can continue to receive payments until the public sector entity is able to start paying again. And then public ESCOs, super ESCOs, these types of funds have helped. And I think where a lot of people or a lot of governments underplay the importance of is building the ESCO, building demand for ESCOs. It's creating large obligations for large consumers, bundling ESCO projects, offering incentives for early ESCO projects, provide public support, using the public sector. All of these things can help build demand. And if you have demand for ESCOs, it certainly is a signal to the market that new companies may want to enter the market. I just want to talk about a couple of points that have been important for us. One is this one-year energy performance contract model. People always say, oh, come on, if it's a one-year model, you're not paying from savings. It's not really an ESCO, is it? It's not, but it's a really, really important stepping stone. Again, that's proved important for us. What does it look like? Basically, you hire someone to do a simple audit where it's not an investment grade audit. It's not really a walkthrough audit, something a little bit more than that. We then bundle that audit with a simple tender, usually design build in the case there's a building renovation to be made, or supply install in the case if it's just equipment. We specify a minimum level of savings, but we give the ESCOs and the bidders an opportunity to provide whatever other additional measures they would like. And then we select based on the highest net present value, provided you've met the minimum savings requirement. And then what's most important is how we pay. So we do have a number of fixed payments. Once you do a detailed energy audit, you get paid. Technical design, you get paid. If the renovation work is completed and signed off by all parties based on the technical design, again, you get a big payment. And then there's the 1 to 2 week performance test where you're just checking to make sure the equipment's working properly. It's providing the agreed level of output based on the energy input. And as long as it's within a reasonable amount of the promised net present value, then you can pay. Sometimes we would ask to hold 10% for 6 to 12 months just to make sure there's good performance throughout that 1 year period. Why is this important? Because it makes financing of the ESCO substantially easier. Many ESCOs can say, well, if I'm going to get my money back within 12 months, this is something that's much, much easier for me to do rather than waiting for payments over a period of 5, 7, or even 10 years. And it's still an opportunity to test the audit process, to make sure the audits are credible, to test the ability for an ESCO to bring in lots of different end-use systems together in one package, selection based on net present value, a performance test, which is the start of a more complex measurement verification protocol. So many systems are already being developed, even if you only have a 1 year contract. And then over time, you can stretch the contract out and introduce more complexities. But again, as a stepping stone, we found this extremely important and effective. And we've had a lot of very successful 1 year contracts in many of our countries. The other thing is the financing, and many people think about credit lines, as Dilip mentioned. There's a very wide range of different financing schemes that can be offered to help ESCOs out. We have done a lot of energy efficiency revolving funds where the debt is provided to the ESCO or to the client for ESCO projects. Public ESCOs, but we've done a lot of other, used a lot of other schemes as well. So, the more advanced the market is, the further up the ladder you may want to consider. In the early days, you may want to consider something simpler, but you should always be seeking to move up the ladder because too often we see people, we say, well, we did 5 pilots with grant financing and now we can't scale it up because they haven't really figured out how to transition away from grants or even public funds to more commercial financing. So you should always be seeking to develop the market over time. We also say there's a lot of other stuff that do need to be in place. Again, Dilip talked about many of these. It's the policy framework, strengthening institutions that can help with a range of functions, financing, but also information and data is really important. Data is one of the things that's really lacking in a lot of our client countries, and developing good, credible data, good case studies, good databases on energy consumption, benchmarking, all of these are really, really helpful, both for consumers as well as ESCOs. And final, building the technical capacity of everyone, because it's not only important to train ESCOs, but also train ESCO customers, so the customers understand what to look for in an ESCO and what to negotiate when they're discussing a potential project with an ESCO. So what have we learned? Or what are some recommendations? The local market's really, really important. Understanding it and developing tailored models to suit the local market are really, really important. You will see there's always precedents in the market. Oftentimes these are PPPs that often do work well. And if some of these models work well, why not adopt similar precedents when developing simple ESCO contracts? Formulate approaches to deal with all of the areas that we mentioned: simple models, financing, enabling environment, and building demand. Too often we see people focus just on financing or just on the enabling environment and not the other three, but really you need to do all four in order to increase your chances for success. Engage with market actors early. All of the different elements, governments, potential clients, ESCOs, auditing companies, all of them have important and useful information and useful comments and suggestions about how the program should be designed, because they are the ones that really have the most experience in a particular market. Flexibility is really important because markets continue to evolve over the course of a program. And so one model that may work in year 1 or year 2 may not be the right model by year 4, by year 5. Sometimes there's not a lot of ESCOs, so competitive financing or competitive tenders may be less important than later in the program when there's quite a few more ESCOs that want to compete for these contracts. Lowering transaction cost is really, really, really important. The more you can develop templates early, the better. It'll make it easier for everyone. But the mistake some countries often make is they standardize too early before they really know what works. And so it's good developing templates, but wait to standardize until you really have enough successes in the market. And finally, whenever lessons you learn, good and bad, share them with the market. So often governments try and hide the failures, but it's important to share those failures, because at the end of the day, the whole market has a stake in succeeding. And so it's useful to understand why certain contract models failed, or who didn't pay and why they didn't pay. If there was a problem with the measurement and verification process, what was that problem, so that everyone can collectively find solutions to these issues. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, Jess. We are a bit more on the solution side here, which is great. We have a number of questions already in the chat, and just because the presentations are over now, please don't stop sending questions. We still have at least 15 minutes to complete our session. Let me start with the first question, which is to Dilip. The question is here: is the limitation on public debt really a barrier for ESCOs? Since ESCO's remuneration usually is based on achieving savings, I would assume this not to be an issue. Rather the opposite, as the public sector has limits to debt, they can engage ESCOs rather than finance energy efficiency projects themselves.
The answer to that is that in some countries, the payments to the ESCO under whatever the contract says, if they're going to pay a certain amount to the ESCOs, that is considered a debt responsibility, and that then counts against their ability to meet their requirements. So some municipalities, for example, they're already borrowed enough to meet their limit, and taking on an ESCO project where they are obligated to pay back a certain amount, that is considered debt, and that must be excluded if what you said, or what the question said, is that it's better for them to do it if that ESCO payment is not considered debt. And this has been done in some countries. Bulgaria, for example, any borrowings that lead to energy efficiency projects by ESCOs, those are not counted against their debt limitations. And that's what needs to be done.
I hope that answered the question. Thanks a lot, Dilip. Next question is probably for Jas. It says the lack of regulation, for instance, energy efficiency standards for buildings and appliances, and proper enforcement of said regulation are usually responsible for low comfort and services levels as the starting point of an audit. What ends up demanding that the energy efficiency project not only provide savings, but also correct this deficit, what's often difficult, if not impossible? How can the elaboration and implementation of standards be streamlined? And what can be done to mitigate the power of importers, suppliers who often do not want regulation, for instance, appliance labeling, and lobby to delay, hinder it? Was the question
so a multi-part question. Let me just offer a few thoughts on that. So it's true, a lot of countries do have some sort of standards and building codes. Sometimes they may be quite weak. Many times they are poorly enforced, if enforced at all. And this is an issue. But at the end of the day, if you're talking about a poor country that's struggling to provide sufficient budget to a school to keep their lights and their heating and their cooling on all year, it's not for a lack of building codes. It's just because there's a limited public budget and there's massive needs. So, we have renovated a lot of buildings, tens of thousands of buildings in ECA in Europe and Central Asia, for example. And in every single one of them, the buildings were underheated. Sometimes at 15, 16 degrees instead of 20, which is the building code, the norm. But most times, if we recognize that, we were able to renovate the building, have a good return on the project, and still go from 16 degrees to 20 degrees. We've seen this even in warmer climates where we could improve the internal comfort levels by providing better cooling as well as energy efficiency gains. So it's just important to recognize that there's other benefits and there's other drivers for this renovation. Energy efficiency is one of them, but we have to understand there may be other issues as well. Better functionality of the building, better comfort levels, improvements to the building. And in some cases, this can be accommodated by maybe taking a small portion of the energy savings, but providing huge social benefit. Or in other cases, we just have to recognize that the government has to put some grant money into the project and say, look, we want this project to be renovated on a commercial basis, but we're going to provide a 20% grant because we recognize that some of the things we're asking for in the tender may be not purely energy efficiency related. They may be related to improving the quality of the building or the comfort levels of the building, which don't have a commercial return. So finding a way to be able to do both ultimately will provide much better socioeconomic benefits for the public clients.
Thanks, Jas. Another one to you concerning Ghana, where the interest rates provided by commercial banks simply do not allow ESCO investments, because the interest is about 20–30% even. This makes it hard for ESCOs to expand their offer. On the other hand, the World Bank is providing support to Ghana through grants and concessional loans. In your opinion, what could be proposed to the government in terms of utilizing the World Bank support to best facilitate ESCOs' access to credit at a reasonable price or reasonable terms?
Well, it's an issue in many of our countries that the financial sector is severely underdeveloped. And it's not just high interest rates is a big issue. Another big issue is very, very short loan tenors, where banks will only offer a 1, 2, or 3-year loan, which is incompatible with a 5 or 7 or 10-year ESCO contract. So there's a number of issues which have to be resolved, and unfortunately, none of these are quick fixes. It takes a very, very long time to sort out the financial sector. Where we feel that the banking sector is not capable in the short term of providing financing, then in some cases, the only option is to provide public financing. It's not our first option, but it may be an option we have to consider. And that's why we've developed energy efficiency funds, for example, in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, oftentimes the interest rates are high, or banks don't want to lend to the public sector, or the loan tenors are very, very short. And for building renovations in that part of the world, the payback periods tend to be even more than 10 years, often maybe 15 to 20 years. So we've had to use public funds, World Bank money combined with oftentimes EU money or government money to capitalize a revolving fund, which is publicly owned and publicly operated. And then that public fund finances energy efficiency projects until such time as the banking sector is able to step in. Now, we always want the fund not to just sit and enjoy the monopoly status that they have, but we want to encourage them to, where they can, offer guarantees to get banks to lend if banks are willing to do so. As Dilip mentioned, sometimes we could do blended financing, 50% from the fund, 50% from a bank, so at least the interest rate will be less. But if the banks just don't want to lend, then at least the funds can continue to finance energy efficiency projects and ESCO projects until such time as the banks are able and willing to lend at a more reasonable cost.
Maybe a follow-up question to that one. You also mentioned tenure, and the question goes on if you can explain more on the one-year ESCO contracts. As the nature of ESCO should be mid to long-term contracts. Actually, it's provide enough time for ESCO companies to get paid for the savings of supply. So how does an annual contract allow that?
So, it doesn't, as I mentioned, it doesn't meet the requirements of a full pay from savings contract. But if you're a private company and you say, well, listen, I'm just not sure if the project is going to save money. And the company says, fine, we will come, we will design the project, we'll install the project. And after the project's done, for 2 weeks, we will do tests and we will show you that it saved the energy that we promised that it would save. And if you're satisfied with that, then you just pay us in full. And it allows the ESCO to get its money back. There's still a performance contract in place. The ESCO is not just providing the equipment and running away. They have to be there and they have to prove that it saves the energy. But the ESCO can be recapitalized right away. And then the industry can continue to service the debt over the long term. If the biggest concern of the private company or the customer, the ESCO client, is the technology risk and the construction risk, then those are eliminated after the performance test. Now, obviously, this is as I said, it's a stepping stone. If you've done some of these and they're effective, then I would move to a 1-year contract or a 2-year contract. And then eventually you can move to a 5-year contract or a 10-year contract. But if the biggest concern of ESCOs is they're not sure if they're going to be paid over the long term, this is a great way to take some of the credit risk away from the ESCO and just put it on a bank that may be more willing to provide this long-term financing. But again, it's a stepping stone towards full service ESCOs. It certainly is not a replacement for them.
All right. One, and I think that would be our last question for Dilip. Regarding technical assistance, in the US, the Department of Energy has a list of certified project facilitators who are defined as experienced, unbiased advisors who guide the agency through the project development and implementation process by providing technical and financial advice. Are you aware of any similar programs around the world?
Well, in Germany, the Berlin Energy Agency or Berlin Energy Service Provider have a similar role. They basically advise public agencies on potential opportunities for our energy efficiency improvement and actually help them design and even manage to some extent the ESCO contract. That's a very good example. In fact, they do more of that than in Germany than in the US. Jazz, you have another example? Basically, we call them.
I was thinking of 7 in the Czech Republic. They they're a similar model. They're sort of an NGO type, and rather than acting as an ESCO, they advise clients on how to engage in ESCO, and they help them through the tendering process and the negotiation process. And they're recognized in the market as being impartial, and so they do this for a fee.
I'm wondering if this is a point where at least you can make a parallel to what super ESCOs might be doing on behalf of public sector entities. Any comment on that, Dilip?
Super ESCOs do a lot more than that, in that they actually are responsible for engaging with the public agencies in designing and managing the implementation themselves. So in other words, they will actually engage private ESCOs to do the implementation process, but they will provide the overall contracting, managing, and financing support. So they do a lot more than, for example, what you mentioned, the US advisors as well as the Berlin and the Czech. Those are mostly advisory roles. The super ESCO is actually a much bigger role in terms of implementation, and they actually identify the projects, engage with the contracts with public agencies, aggregate projects where appropriate, and essentially help implementation.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have actually run out of questions, and it is exactly on the hour. So I would first of all thank you, Jazz and Dilip, very much for your excellent presentations. They will be uploaded and available on our website. Aris will do that it'll probably take a little week's time, but you can find the recording on the website. You will get an email if you're registered for this this webinar when the recording is available. And then thank you very much, all of you out there who have been joining us today and listening to our presentation and taking interest in the ESCO market. It's great to have you on board. We hope you will join us another time. We have another ESCO-focused webinar already next week. I'm sure you will receive the invitation if you have not already received it. And finally, do remember to mark the date 7th and 8th of May 2025 for the second International ESCO Symposium in Istanbul. We would really love to see you there as well. So thank you very much. Over and out from Copenhagen.